Hello and welcome to a very special edition of The Royal Beat. Today coming to you from an iconic location teeming with royal history. We are at Kensington Palace. The doors to the palace have just been reopened to the public, and this is a home that over the years has housed many a king, queen and princess. In fact, as I stand here today, this is the home of our future king. Kate and William live behind these palace doors. I'm going to be taking you and our cameras, though, into parts of the building that have never been seen by the public before. So come with me as we enter Queen Victoria's bedroom. Hello and welcome to this very special edition of The Royal Beat. We're coming to you today from Queen Victoria's bedroom here at Kensington Palace. In fact, it was in this room that she was woken as an 18-year-old girl to be told that overnight she had become the Queen of England. Quite a story and quite the surroundings. And joining me here today, would you please welcome my guests? I have Roy Nicker from the Sunday Times, their royal editor, historian Christopher Warwick, lovely to see you, Richard Kay, royal journalist, and royal expert Ingrid Seward, lovely to see you all. Is this your first time in Queen Victoria's bedroom?
It certainly is.
It is for me.
Good, I'm pleased to hear it. These rooms have just been opened, or reopened to the public. We'll be talking about that and so much more about what has happened in these incredible palace walls in today's show on the day that would have been Princess Margaret's 90th birthday. But before we get into all of that, let's take a look back at what is one of probably the lesser-known palaces throughout history, sitting here in a prime location in Kensington, a home that has really been a very focal point for great members of our royal family across the years.
Hidden away in London's Kensington Gardens is the royal family's most exclusive and private building. Almost 100 years older than nearby Buckingham Palace, it's been a home for monarchs and their families since the 17th century. 400,000 visitors each year are allowed to walk through its staterooms, but the public areas are only a tiny fraction of the entire estate. What we never see is what makes Kensington Palace unique. Beyond the security cameras and high fences is the heavily guarded residential area, home to a whole array of princes and princesses.
And let us not forget that whilst this is open to the public, large portions of this palace are closed off because it's still a royal home. In fact, let's just take a little run through, Christopher, if you will, as to which of the royal members of the royal family live here today.
Well, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge live in what's known as apartment 1A.
Which was home to Princess Margaret.
Which was home to Princess Margaret, and before that had been home to Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Louise, who sculpted the statue of Queen Victoria, which is just outside the palace here, opposite the Round Pond. At apartment 10, on the other side of the courtyard, we have Prince and Princess Michael of Kent. And in Wren House, we have the Duke of Kent and his wife, Catherine. And at Ivy Cottage, there is Princess Eugenie and her husband, Jack Brooksbank. So it's quite a busy residence still.
Now, of course, Richard, one of the most famous residents of this palace is a woman that you covered extensively during your time at the Daily Mail, Princess Diana.
Yeah.
Was this a happy home for her?
It was a mixture, really, for her. In many ways, it was a happy home. She has some very happy memories here, raising William and Harry, and the early days of the marriage, which were actually quite happy. But it became, later on, a prison, if you like, for her. It symbolised everything that she found so frustrating about being a royal princess. She felt spied on, but the spying on was really for her own protection. The security cameras you see all over the place. She felt that the police that guarded the palace were constantly reporting on her movements, who her friends were, who came to see her. So it became a real difficulty for her because she couldn't really decide if she wanted to completely break free from that royal life and strike out and live outside the palace, or whether she needed the protection that it afforded her. And in the end, by the time of her death, I think she'd more or less decided that she needed to stay here.
She needed to stay here. Interesting. So many parallels in so many ways, Roy, as to what we're seeing with Harry and his decisions to strike out. But of course, for so long, this palace was presided over by the Queen's much-loved sister, Margaret, whose birthday we would be celebrating today. She would have been 90. Let's talk about her time here, because actually she breathed new life into this palace after what it had become known for as kind of just a place to reside for old aunts, really, was pretty much the deal.
The Duke of Windsor, when he was Prince of Wales, actually referred to Kensington Palace as the Aunt Heap.
Yes, I wasn't going to be quite as harsh, but the Aunt Heap, I mean, how did it earn that beautiful name?
Well, simply because there were kind of older aunts, like Queen Victoria's daughters, Princess Louise lived here, her sister Princess Beatrice lived here, the Athlones lived in Clock House, you know, so there were a lot of extraneous members of the royal family, dowagers such as the widow of Queen Victoria's youngest son, Prince Leopold, who was Duke of Albany. She lived at Kensington Palace. You know, the whole place was pretty much swarming with royals and courtiers. It was a hive of activity, really, but earning itself the name of the Aunt Heap.
Ingrid, let's talk about how much of a storm it would have caused here at the Aunt Heap when news reached the palace that Margaret and Tony were moving in and that they had plans to shake this place up, and they sure did, didn't they?
Well, the government certainly were very down on them, and they scrutinised every bit of information they got about how much it was going to cost and what they wanted to do. And of course, Tony Snowdon, extremely adept at designing things. He had a big input into it. And of course, it cost a great deal of money, but it didn't cost anything like it would cost today.
Oh, as we've seen those costs, because there's huge transparency around that with the renovations that Kate and William have done here.
Yeah, I mean, I believe, actually Christopher is the expert on this, but I believe you said it was 50,000, didn't you, Christopher?
Well, for Margaret's.
For Margaret's,
no,
yes.
When they first moved here, they moved into apartment 10. Now, Queen Victoria's grandson, Dorino, the Marquis of Carisbrooke, had lived there. And when he died, the Queen immediately earmarked this house because she did not think it would be a good idea for Margaret and Tony to begin their married life living under mother's roof at Clarence House. So they came to number 10. And then they were allocated apartment 1A, which had been left to rot since the death of Princess Louise in 1939.
And it was really crumbling, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
I mean, there were great vast holes in the floorboards, and the place was a total wreck. And the criticism from government or certain ministers was that this was a huge amount of money to be spent on providing... 85.
85?
Yeah, 85.
Which back then would have been
it's the equivalent
a king's ransom, no pun intended.
And it's the equivalent of about £1.5 million today.
Probably more even, do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
But then when you look at the costs of the most recent refurbishments,
well,
not quite so extortionate.
No, and what we have to remember is that this is a Wren building. So if it isn't kept up to date, if it isn't repaired, if it isn't refurbished, what are you going to do? Like apartment 1A after Princess Louise, it will rot.
Mm-hmm. And we've read reports that because there was so many eyes on the budget, that Margaret and Tony actually decided to just kind of pick up the paintbrushes and start to redecorate literally themselves. Any truth in that?
Well, yes, they did. When they divided, Princess Louise had this huge drawing room, and the Snowdons decided that it was going to be, they were going to take a part of it and turn it into a dining room, and then have the rest of that particular section as a drawing room. So they had mahogany, double mahogany doors between the drawing room and the dining room, and these were what they varnished themselves, you know, planed them down, varnished them and all the rest of it. So they did an awful lot to try and cut cost at that house.
So it was a home that was restored with much love, and they were a couple that were incredibly sociable. Did they bring the party back to Kensington Palace?
Well, they did, and we tend to forget now what a glamorous young couple Margaret and Tony Snowdon were. I mean, they really were the epitome of glamour in the swinging 60s. They moved here in 1960 after their wonderful wedding, and it sort of rejuvenated Kensington Palace and brought a great breath of fresh air into the place. And yes, they moved in rather racy circles. Tony was always being described in those days as a bohemian. He rode a motorbike. No, wow. And Margaret sometimes rode
Is that what
pillion
qualified him as
passenger on the
bohemian?
back. Well, I think that and his rather rackety private life that he had, but we won't go into that. But they did have a very glamorous circle. I mean, Margaret was Princess Diana, she was Meghan, she was Kate of her day. I mean,
Yes.
an extremely glamorous
All
young
rolled
woman.
into
All
one.
rolled
And
into
then they
one.
had all these sort of movie stars that they were friends with, Peter Sellers. And I mean, to Margaret, they loved actors, didn't she? They
Well, she
loved
did.
show business.
Yeah, she did. I mean, she said that one thing that always amazed her was when people said that Tony had introduced her to the world of film and theatre. She said, but that was one of the things that drew us together. And they absolutely loved it. I mean, I was talking with Judi Dench on one occasion, and she said that Margaret and Tony and friends had been to Syria and whatever she happened to be in at the time. This is years ago. And she'd been invited back to Kensington Palace here. And on her arrival, Princess Margaret said, we've saved some food for you, and so we're going to sit and watch you eat. Munch, munch, munch. But that was so typical. People got invited back. And there was also a wonderful story of when Elizabeth Taylor was in London, appearing in a play called The Little Foxes. And she was coming back to dinner here. And this is not long after the big sparkly ring incident, you know, Hollywood vulgarity in a way. So the princess decided that if Elizabeth Taylor was coming to dinner, she was going to have all the gold and all the silver table decorations on the table. And the wonderful little Scottish housekeeper that they had at the time came in and she saw this table laden with all this stuff. And she said to the butler, oh, not the gold and the silver, surely. And a little voice from behind her said, oh, yes. Isn't it vulgar? That was the princess.
That's a wonderful story. I love that.
We
It's
know,
great.
of course, as much as she had the eye of a magpie in terms of being attracted to all that glitters, she also shared an incredible bond with her sister, the Queen.
As she grew older, Margaret turned to her sister for strength and comfort and found both. For all their differences, they were drawn together by a powerful bond. They alone knew what it was like to grow up in a confusing world where they were the most privileged people in the whole kingdom, and yet in some ways the least free. It was a world where the mystique that went with merely being royal had for much of their lives protected them. That world had gone forever for two sisters who still called one another Lilibet and Margot. And their last link with that world was that indomitable woman, their mother.
And don't forget, you can watch that and so many more documentaries here on True Royalty TV. Now, that relationship between Margaret and her sister, we've seen it documented and reported in so many different ways. How did you read their relationship, Roya? Were they close? Was there a trust at play?
Yeah, they absolutely were. I think, you know, so much is made about how different they were, Margaret being the sort of more spirited, lively one and the Queen being the level-headed monarch. But they were hugely close because they lived through extraordinary times. I mean, these were princesses not born to the roles that they ended up doing. And they had a unique understanding and a unique bond because of it. And, you know, I think there's no doubt, landmark moments in Princess Margaret's life, you know, there's a lot always made about her love affair with Group Captain Peter Townsend, and the fact that, you know, the Queen had to make decisions putting duty before family. But regardless of that, they shared an extraordinarily close bond, and I think you could really see at the time of Princess Margaret's death the extreme sorrow and how moved the Queen was when that happened.
Do you think that she continues to miss her sister to this day?
I think she does. And I think they have been portrayed as not being so close. For instance, in The Crown, I don't know if we're allowed to mention that, but
We
I
certainly
thought
are.
the portrayal in that was really not a bit how I've ever seen their relationship.
Really?
Their relationship was very, very close.
Yes, it was.
I mean, there was a time in the 1970s when Princess Margaret met and became involved with Roddy Llewellyn, who was a young man. You know, he was 17 years younger than her. And it didn't do Princess Margaret any favours. And, it was quite scandalous. I mean, I always say that, look, if the boot had been on the other foot, if it had been an older man with a 17-year-old female, what would the reaction have been? It would have been, lucky him. But the boot being on the other foot, the older woman, the younger man, it all caused a lot of scandal. And the Queen was known to have said to, so one of her private secretaries told me, to Jim Callaghan, who was then the Prime Minister, words to the effect, what are we going to do about my sister's gutter-snipe life? Now, it might then be thought that there was some rift between them, and there wasn't. The Queen was always very, very supportive, but it went back to childhood when the Queen was always looking out for her sister. One of the reasons being that she thought precisely what was going to happen years later, that she would do something wrong. And the relationship between Princess Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn was seen by certain people, let's say, as being very wrong. And there was an opinion poll at the time that I think something like 87% of those asked thought that she'd brought the monarchy into disrepute.
I don't think they'd think that now, would they?
and
They'd probably say, yes, Margaret, wonderful, lucky lady.
I can tell you that much later in life, the Queen thanked Roddy for taking care of her sister, and she was very gracious about it because he had given her stability, happiness, at a period of her life where she was very down and very miserable.
Very vulnerable.
And very vulnerable. And so she was very grateful to Llewellyn.
It was the worst, you know, the early 70s was probably the worst period in Princess Margaret's life. The marriage was over. The marriage to Tony was over. Tony had been a serial adulterer. Margaret had her dalliances as well, and as a friend of theirs put it to me, was so much easier for you to carry on doing what you want to do if your partner is doing the same thing. But the one relationship that Princess Margaret wanted to work was her marriage, was that relationship with her husband. She said to me on one occasion, I never wanted to be a divorcee.
A bit like Charles and Diana.
Well,
that's exactly what Diana said, wasn't it?
And
Like
also,
Charles.
I mean, we talk about the age difference, that there was an older princess dating a younger Roddy Llewellyn. Let's just remind ourselves of how old Diana was when it was announced that she was dating Charles and the age he was at that stage in his life.
Well, there's a 12-year age gap between Charles and Diana. And Diana was virtually a child when she met the Prince of Wales. And we tend to forget that. I mean, she was only 20 when she married.
19 when they announced their engagement.
You know, and the children came very quickly.
A young 20, wasn't she? And she was very immature.
And funnily enough, there's another Kensington Palace connection here, because on that honeymoon, when they were up in Scotland at Balmoral, Charles had arranged one of his aides to get a book he wanted to give to Diana, and it was a book about Queen Adelaide. It was a biography of her, who was married to William IV, residence here, and Queen Adelaide and William IV had a very long and happy marriage, but there was a big age gap between them. Funnily enough, it was the same. It was 12 years. And he thought this might be something useful for her to read.
But she didn't.
But picking up also on the point that Richard made about Roddy and Princess Margaret, I mean, what Roddy did, he gave back to Princess Margaret everything that Tony had stripped her of, her dignity, her sense of worth. You know, I mean, it got to the point in the marriage where the princess would actually write him notes saying, you know, if you could say something kind to me and I will try and do everything for
Notes,
you.
of course, were
And-
figures of the whole marriage. And I mean, he wrote
yeah.
monstrous notes to her.
He was.
Which he would leave for her to find under her pillow, in her bookmark. I mean, really
Yeah, in her
unpleasant.
glove drawer.
So there was a great cruelty at play, and
Yeah.
It was an abusive marriage. You know, people wouldn't have said that at the time, but it actually was an abusive marriage.
So for her to find happiness with Roddy was, as her sister, I'm sure the Queen was both again conflicted between duty and family.
But I think this time around, time had moved on. It wasn't the 1950s. We talked about Peter Townsend earlier, and the Queen was determined that Margaret should have some fun in her life at this late stage. And, you know, by the late 1970s, England was a very different place from the mid-50s.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the time that Charles and Diana would have taken up residence here as a newly married couple, and the stage that their relationship was at then. Was that a happy time in their marriage?
Well, I think when they first came here, there was a great deal of happiness. They were planning a home. Diana had her ideas, Charles had his, but you know, they designed a very happy family home. And to start with, things were okay between them. I mean, it wasn't okay for long, but yeah, when they first moved here in 1981, I think Diana, particularly enjoyed designing everything and making the choices. Charles had pretty much done Highgrove, and she got the run of Kensington Palace.
Let's just remind ourselves visually of what that couple looked like as they planned to turn this place from Kensington Palace into their first home together.
In 1981, 700 million people watched as she arrived at St Paul's Cathedral and prepared to take her vows, the small white figure at the centre of a royal spectacular. A nursery school teacher hardly out of her teens, Lady Diana Frances Spencer had little experience of the world and none of the royal life she was about to enter on the arm of her proud father, Earl Spencer. A private wedding ceremony transformed into a worldwide media event. It was a taste of things to come. As the new Princess of Wales stepped out to face the crowds, her private life became a part of the public domain and would now be a constant source of speculation. The most eligible bachelor in the world had found his wife in a girl 12 years his junior, who'd once lived next door on the Sandringham estate. It was the romance of the 21st century and a story that would run and run.
And didn't it just? We're still talking about it to this very day. So once the family started to grow and the boys were born, what would life have been like here, Roya, for the young princes and Diana and Charles as young parents?
Well, for the princes, certainly. I mean, they've talked a lot in recent years, particularly around anniversaries of Diana's death, about how happy those first few years were and the very happy memories they have of being here with their mother, of practical jokes, of William coming home from school and Diana arranging to have Naomi Campbell standing on the stairs because she was pinned on his pin board and she knew that would embarrass him. And I think by all accounts, as the Princess of Wales, although later in life had a very unhappy time in her marriage, was always very determined to keep the home life for William and Harry as happy and nurturing as possible. And they did, we all know because we've all talked about it and read about it. They had the most extraordinarily close bond with their mother until her death. And that was, all founded in home time here at Kensington Palace.
I often wonder, Richard, how you think the boys view this place now. Certainly for William, who uses this as his main family residence, because at the time of Diana's death, those gates there was a sea of flowers.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody walks up that famous path and thinks of anything but that, despite the centuries of history that sit behind these walls.
So, I mean, Charles and Diana went out of their way to make sure that the home life for William and Harry was a happy one. And Roya mentioned the treats that Diana often brought for the boys when they were a bit older, but when they were younger, I remember they had lots of school parties. They went to schools locally in Notting Hill, just on the other side of the park, and they were always inviting their friends back to parties here, and lots of good things went on, and Diana took them to the local shops, the local restaurants, and they were a fixture. They were a part of Kensington life, if you like. And I think that drew William back here, actually, in 2011, after he married Kate, even though there must have been all those skeletons rattling around, and he must have had some thoughts about how unhappy his mother had ultimately been at times here.
Because they had also looked at the apartments, the 8 and 9,
Yeah.
which is where they lived.
They did.
And then,
They
of
look
course...
so different now.
Do they?
Yes, we went to a press party there, and William and Harry were, you know, it was them to talk to the press, and it was completely different. And I said to Harry, does it make you feel strange being back here in your sort of family home? And he said, well, no, it doesn't. I can't even remember which room was which. And I thought that was really interesting. But I know it had been the Prince of Wales's drawing school, and it had been through a few little metamorphoses. But you'd think he would have remembered it more.
So those were the apartments in which they were raised by their mother,
Yes.
predominantly, and their father when they were still together.
Yes.
But of course, once William returned here as a married man with a young family, it was apartment 1A that he identified as the place that would be their home. The 1A suggests it's quite a tiny place. That's not the case at all, is it?
No, it's not. It's enormous.
How many rooms would you say?
Well, it has 20 rooms from the basement to the attic, but it's not a small house.
Why is it called an apartment?
Yeah, but all of these royal residences here at Kensington Palace are called apartments, which of course makes people immediately think they're flats, or the American term for apartment, you know, meaning it's a flat. They're not. If you think of Kensington Palace in a way as it's built around 3 courtyards, and if you kind of think of them as being these wonderful red brick terraced houses, if you like, because they are, although they're all joined, they are separate houses.
Pretty grand inside. I mean,
Well, Margaret's house, I always thought that going into Princess Margaret's house, it was like going into just the most wonderful 18th century house. And this is how she liked it. And the wonderful thing is, it's so quiet. And I remember time after time coming out of apartment 1A of an evening, and the gas lamps were on, because the courtyard is lit by gas lamps, lanterns with the crowns
To this
above
day?
them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really? How
And it's a
lovely.
cobblestone courtyard. And when you come out of that house into Clock Court, as it's known, and I've often said, and this is when the ghosts come out to play.
It's very beautiful. I always think it's like the countryside in the middle of London.
It is.
Well, it was. Well, we must remember that actually this was originally selected as a royal palace because it was a country home. It was somewhere to get out of the city in the village of Kensington.
Well, that's because William IV was an asthmatic. And so he needed to get away from the Thames and Whitehall. And this, as you rightly say, was the small village of Kensington.
In the depths of the countryside.
In the depths of the
Yes, it was.
countryside.
It was.
And it was known originally as Nottingham House because the Earl of Nottingham owned it. And William and Mary bought it, and the rest is history.
And called in Christopher Wren, and before you know it, wham, bam, it's huge and really quite spectacular.
And they moved in before it finished.
Well, she put quite some pressure on the builders, as I understand, to the point that they were under such pressure that they moved in. And there was a tragic accident, actually, because she'd rushed them. One of the walls wasn't up to fit purpose, and it came tumbling down and took a man's life.
Yeah.
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 One of the, I mean, despite the fact that literally history pours from every room in this palace, I don't know about you, but it's hard to see past those images from 1997, when literally that lawn was awash with floral tributes. Let's talk about that moment and how that's redefined this palace.
I think Kensington Palace today is indelibly linked to Diana, and very particularly, as you say, to the outpouring of grief that followed her sudden and obviously unexpected death. Interestingly enough, there is the question of, were people mourning for themselves or were they mourning for her? Because this was somebody who was a public figure that most people didn't know, but she touched people's lives in such an indescribable way. Was it because she was young, she was beautiful, or what was it?
I think it was because she was unhappy. There was something of a Greek tragedy about her life, and I think women all over the world could really relate to Diana because she had experienced so many things that so many other women had experienced.
Well, and also,
basically an unhappy marriage.
She'd also had the guts to stand up and say, it's my time now. I'm stepping back. I'm making some changes. She was going to walk a very different path, a new path. She was building her own path. I mean, Richard, you were across the story of Diana from the get-go. Would you say that there's some truth to that?
I think there was some truth to that. I mean, it is, as Christopher says, it seems to me anyway, living through that remarkable week between her death and her funeral. Some people said that sort of Britain sort of lost all sort of control of its senses. I don't think it was like that at all. Diana, there was a connection that people had with Diana. Most of the people here didn't know her, never met her, never even spoken to her, but they felt she was part of their lives and they wanted to come. And it was an incredibly powerful few days. I mean, it was hot, and I remember one of the things I most remember was the strong fragrance of the flowers, and which, of course, got rather unpleasant as the week got on, but they were constantly being renewed and refreshed. And also seeing these trails of people, tens of thousands of them, clutching these little gifts, often crying at night. And I remember that being in the garden, Kensington Gardens, the night of her funeral, and her mother came out, and she was wandering around. She had a headscarf on. She didn't particularly want to be recognised, but she did, and she took all this in, and she was incredibly moved by the whole sight. I went around for a while with her, and quite a few of Diana's friends and family came too. And it kind of sank in then. I mean, the funeral itself had been massive, but that night, it really, the full impact, I think, that she'd had on people and on Britons struck home.
And it wasn't, the flowers weren't just here. I mean, this was a huge field, but if you went down the Mall outside Buckingham Palace was...
And St James's Palace.
And St James's Palace.
You look at those scenes, that's extraordinary. I don't think we've seen anything like that since.
Or before.
No, quite.
Definitely not.
And you talk about the fact that women really related to her. Do you think there's also something in the fact that she was an agent for change, that she went out of her way to highlight causes that nobody else would touch because they're a bit problematic, a bit tricky, a bit uncomfortable, be they landmines, be they HIV, that actually she was seen by so many as a beacon of hope and a bit of a trailblazer? Well,
she was. I mean, from the very moment she grasped the hand of that AIDS sufferer at the Middlesex Hospital, that was a totemic moment in her life, and I think it did persuade her that she had some kind of role. I don't want to get too existential about this, but she felt that there were elements of society, the dispossessed, the poor, the elderly, the ill, whom she could be a voice for, and really that's what Ingrid, I think she sort of devoted her public life to.
I came here literally a month, or 6 weeks before she died. Obviously, I didn't, you know, because I'd written something in Richard's paper, the Daily Mail, that she didn't like. And so her secretary rang and said, I think we should have the Princess thinks you should have a little girly chat. So I duly came here and had a very long girly chat with her.
What was she unhappy with and what was said?
She was very about that. Oh, it was... it was this, about that she was driving, someone was driving into the palace with somebody under a rug at the back of the car, which was, you know, I didn't know who it was.
So you were implying that she had a gentleman caller?
Yes, which she did, of course.
Right. But what was wrong with that? She was a single woman.
She was really scared that the public were going to get hold of this story, and that was going to ruin her romance. And she thought I knew, which I absolutely didn't. But she thought I knew all about it.
So you were called to the palace to find out what
I knew.
Right.
She wanted to find, which I thought was very clever of her, actually.
And that this story would blight an otherwise...
Yes.
A romance that otherwise had potential?
Had potential, yes, absolutely.
Were you told off by her, or was she courteous?
No, she was really, really sweet, because of course Diana could be 10 different people in one day. And as Richard knows, I mean, but she was really, really sweet, and we laughed a lot, and we talked about Mohammed Al Fayed and what she was, you know, what she'd been doing, and I think but then we did talk about her charity work. She said, "Don't you want to talk about my charity work?" Well, of course, I didn't. I just wanted all the gossip.
And I'm sure there were moments when she did as well, so I'm sure you weren't alone in that, Ingrid.
She was happy with the way she'd evolved and the way that she had moved on from the royal family and was doing the things she wanted.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is fascinating, isn't it? Unfortunately, we have to pop off for a break, but still to come. We're going to be talking about how this went from an idyllic start to a royal romance to potentially feeling like something of a prison. And no, we're not talking about Diana. Plus, why is this palace still the palace of choice for those who stand in line to the throne? That and more after this. Don't miss the Royal Beat on True Royalty TV, the world's first on-demand TV channel devoted to the best documentaries and shows about royalty, bringing you the truth, the context and the backstory. Find out more about your favourite princesses who lived at Kensington Palace in these 3 shows on True Royalty TV. The Real Princess Margaret. This intimate biography explores the reality behind the myth of the Queen's younger sister, Princess Margaret. Diana, the People's Princess. A celebration of Diana's life, exploring her childhood and upbringing with intimate contributions from her nanny, former headmistress and closest friends. Kate, Making of a Modern Queen. This authoritative special presents the story of Kate Middleton and the seemingly ordinary young woman who is now destined to one day be queen. You can get this and more only on True Royalty, the home of Royal TV. Hello and welcome back to the Royal Beat, where we're coming to you today from Queen Victoria's bedroom here at Kensington Palace. I'm still joined by the Sunday Times royal editor, Roy Nicker, historian, Christopher Warwick. Thank you so much for being here. Richard Kay and Majesty Magazine's Ingrid Stewart. Now, in 2013, a very young Prince Harry moved into what was probably one of the most sought-after bachelor pads in London, Nottingham Cottage, which was kind of a nod to the fact that originally this house, this palace, was called Nottingham House.
Nottingham House.
Nottingham House.
Yeah.
Nottingham Cottage, tiny, small.
Just 2 bedrooms.
Yeah, it sits in the grounds here. It became the location for a moment where Meghan Markle pulled a chicken out of the oven, he fell to one knee, and the course of royal history changed, and she said, "Yes, I will."
In November 2017, Nottingham Cottage was the unlikely site of an historic event, one which would ultimately bring yet another princess to live at Kensington Palace.
It happened a few weeks ago here at our cottage. Just a standard, typical night for us.
Cosy night. Well, Harry's proposal to Meghan, by his own account, was charmingly romantic. Harry did it in the kitchen, at home, while they were cooking a roast chicken.
Just an amazing surprise. It was so sweet and natural and very romantic. He got on one knee.
So we hear Harry there referring to it as our cottage, but had Nottingham Cottage originally been his bolt hole here in London?
It was his bolt hole, and the lovely thing about that was that he lived cheek by jowl, as he used to love, alongside William and Kate and the kids. And you know, William and Harry have both chatted about how he used to pop over and sit down and pinch stuff from William and Kate's fridge, and there were a lot of kitchen suppers and a very, very close relationship. And I think that's probably something that Diana would have loved, the fact that her 2 sons were living, you know, at her old home and still very close. And actually, I remember when it was mooted that they were moving out, there was so much sort of surprise that Harry and Meghan weren't going to move into a different apartment here and wanted their own space. But actually, you know, I think actually it's reasonable to not want to live by your brother and sister-in-law. But it was very much, you know, it was his bolt hole, and he loved it.
Richard, would Diana have loved the fact that her boys were living here under one roof?
I hope so. I think she might have done. I mean, I think she would have loved the fact that they were neighbours. I mean, don't forget, Harry had succeeded William as the tenant, if you like, of Notcott. They'd both been in St James's Palace and had very nice apartments there. Their father had given them, and when William got engaged and married Kate, he came here first, the trailblazer, if you like, the first to Kensington Palace. And then it was fairly clear that Harry was going to follow on when William wanted somewhere bigger. So it felt right somehow that Diana's boys were back at Kensington Palace. But as Roy has said, it didn't turn out to be a happy experience for one of them, for Harry.
Can you understand why they would want to start? I mean, Roy, you said quite understandable in some ways that they would want to find their feet in their own place, an address of their own, and also how difficult it might have been for somebody like Meghan coming into what felt like a very established set here at Kensington Palace.
Harry also felt this was a prison.
Did he?
He did. He was actually saying, you know, Kate can't even walk her dog in Kensington Gardens, like, you know, Diana used to go jogging. She can only walk it around the sort of private field. And he said it is definitely a prison. He was desperate to get out.
So it was his lead, not necessarily Meghan's.
That's definitely what he said.
I think it was partly that. I think it's partly the whole hierarchical structure of the royal family, which I think we now know Meghan found extremely difficult to come to terms with. You know, William was not just the eldest son, he was number one. And she and Harry were sufficiently lower down the rank, the pecking order, if you like. And I think living next door to them and being constantly reminded of that may well have played on their minds too. I think it was quite reasonable for them to strike out somewhere else. I'm not sure that Windsor was a good choice. I think there have been plenty of other apartments.
Not the most convenient place to be.
No, maybe.
Unless you want to get to Heathrow.
You know that, Christopher. Yeah. Living there yourself. Yeah.
Well, I'm just reminded of when the Duke and Duchess of Kent lived at Coppins in Buckinghamshire, which is not so far away from Windsor. And in the end, this is why they too came to live at Kensington Palace, because that was, you know, the end of an official engagement that's gone on late at night. You've then got a long drive home. Mm-hmm. And I was a little surprised that Meghan and Harry had Frogmore Cottage. If they intended to fulfill a diary of official engagements.
We talk a lot about Harry and Meghan, but of course this has become the home for the Cambridges. A new family is calling this place their own. What have they brought to this palace, and is this a happy home for them?
I think it is a very happy home. Actually, I remember I broke the story when I was on a different newspaper that they were moving here, which a lot of people, as Richard mentioned, were surprised by. But I remember speaking to some of William's closest aides at the time when I ran the story, and they were very clear that William wanted to move here because he wanted to remember the happy memories with his mother, and he wanted to sort of recreate some of those with his own children. And by all accounts, although they spent a lot of time up at Anmer Hall in Norfolk, you know, this is Cambridge HQ. This is the sort of the powerhouse behind the future king, and it will be for a very long time.
Absolutely. This is where they are during school term times. The kids are at school in London, not too far from here. Both very hands-on, as was Diana, with the school runs and school life. You touched upon earlier the fact that they would have children back from school for play dates effectively. Are we seeing that repeat itself,
Absolutely.
do you think?
Yes.
They've got a beautiful garden, haven't they? I mean, a beautiful walled garden.
At 1A.
Yes.
Yeah, they really have. They really have. And it's the only house here at Kensington Palace that actually has its own private garden. Right. You know, that is to say 1 and 1A have their own private gardens.
Well,
which is slightly ridiculous when you think about the opulence of the place.
Yeah, but that was across the road.
It was across the courtyard,
yeah.
and you had a key to get in. And,
exactly.
And that became... but the boys had a lot of fun in that garden.
But with 1A, you just went out into the garden.
Yeah.
Well, we got a rare glimpse of the Cambridges at home when the Obamas came to visit. And those were, again, you know, we touched upon some of those seminal moments with the documentaries of the Queen and Margaret, but for the Cambridges, that's when we started to see the family behind the Cambridge title, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And we those photos, and everyone went absolutely wild for George in his bathrobe, with the rocking horse, and also I remember actually in your newspaper the next day, Richard, in the Mail, there was literally sort of ornament by ornament breakdown of how the Cambridges had decorated their home and which bits of the royal collection they had chosen, you know, which pictures, which bits of furniture, the photographs, everything was analysed, and you got to see a little glimpse of what Cambridge family home life is like.
And what people have to remember, what we all have to remember, is that they are also human beings. You know, behind the titles, behind all the privilege, the grandeur, the walls of Kensington Palace, these are people that are humans, and they, you know, they do what we do.
With a slight twist, yes. But yes, you're absolutely right, Christopher. And also, I think there's something lovely in, for example, for William being able to teach his kids to ride their bikes in the same courtyard and gardens, and that he and Harry did, that they can go and find that key and get into that secret garden, and that's somewhere that he can take his children now. Those are important moments from parent to child, regardless of the fact that there's two kings at play.
It's a nice continuity, isn't it? I mean, I think this is one thing about Kensington Palace, is the continuity. Not just from an historical point of view, but from a fundamental personal point of view. You know, this is home.
It is for now, but what will happen when Charles finally takes the throne? And will he move to Buckingham Palace? Will Kate and William then cross the park to Clarence House?
Well, I can't help thinking that, you know, Charles may not come to the throne for another 5-6 years. Will he really, in his late 70s, want to up sticks from Clarence House to move to Buckingham Palace?
Will he have a choice?
The official line is that he will. Guy did a big story, a front-page story on the Sunday Times about this a couple of years ago, and it caused quite a stink.
Did it? Why?
The official line is that he will. I wrote that he's...
That he won't.
He's mentioned to a lot of people.
I don't think he will.
Very keen that the distinction may well be that Buckingham Palace remains Monarchy HQ,
the office,
his office. But that he will probably continue to live at Clarence House in Highgrove. The official line is that the Cambridges will one day move to the palace when, you know, they become king and queen. I imagine that it will still be Monarchy HQ, and I wouldn't be surprised if Kensington Palace...
So the Cambridges will still live here?
I suspect.
I think so. I mean, you see, William IV, here's the precedent. William IV, when he became king, now, he was Duke of Clarence, which is why Clarence House is called Clarence House. And he absolutely refused, when he succeeded his brother, he totally refused to leave Clarence House. He hated Buckingham Palace. He called it a white elephant, and he'd have sold it to anybody that have come and said, I'll give you the right price.
Do you want Buckingham Palace?
Yeah.
Well, before we go, because we are almost out of time, does anybody know what they paid for this place when the royals took ownership? No?
What, way back in 1688?
Yes, it was literally a king's ransom, £20,000.
Wow. That's a lot of money.
Wouldn't have a clue what it would go for today. But that really is all we've got time for. Thank you all so much for joining us, Roya, Christopher, Richard and Ingrid. But a huge and heartfelt thanks to the Historic Royal Palaces for allowing us in here today to film at Kensington Palace, a location really quite unlike any other. Don't forget you can watch all of the programmes that we've featured here on the show today on True Royalty TV. There's a free 7-day trial, so you can try before you buy. We'll be back next time. Until then, thank you so much for joining us.